Dante Rossi, the Mafia boss the whole world fears, was in the video I had secretly sent to myself. He was kissing his mistress in a penthouse, completely unaware the camera had been installed by me. I stood before the desk and placed the stack of papers he thought were divorce papers. In truth, they were the first trap I had set, the beginning of exposing the enemy trying to destroy the Rossi family, and the test to see who he would choose. The door opened. The mistress's perfume still clung to his shirt. Damien smirked coldly. "You don't have the guts to leave me, Elena." I simply said, "Just sign." He had no idea. The betrayal he thought he initiated was actually started by me. My name is Elena Rossi, his pregnant legal wife. You have to understand, the marriage wasn't some sudden, dramatic ascent to royalty, and it wasn't a fairy tale in any sense of the word, but it wasn't an immediate prison either. At least not initially. Not until the cracks started showing in Damien's armor and the pressure of his world began to squeeze the humanity out of him. I wasn't some princess who married into this life, draped in diamonds and demanding attention. I grew up on the dusty, forgotten edges of it, seeing the shadows, the brutal, long-term consequences, the quiet desperation of the women who loved these men, and the specific way men like Damien carried the impossible, crushing weight of power like a second, perpetually rigid skin, never allowing themselves a moment of genuine, unguarded rest. My own background, it was profoundly humble. Dirt poor, scraping by, raised in a small, cramped apartment where every expense had to be justified twice, if I'm being completely honest with you. And I spent my entire young life working just to be unseen, to blend into the scenery, to survive without drawing attention, accumulating debt, or incurring the volatile notice of the families. My father was a small-time, honest contractor who did essential but unglamorous repair work for some of the lower-tier families, fixing roofs and foundation cracks, which is exactly how I met Damien in the first place. Not in a glittering, chandelier-lit ballroom, but in a dusty, sun-baked construction yard outside Naples, where I was tracking inventory and double-checking invoices for my father, covered in plaster dust. When Damien brought me into his world, it wasn't because I was flashy or loud or physically demanding. It was because I was quiet. I listened intently to what wasn't being said, and crucially, I never, ever asked for anything transactional, material, or purely selfish. I didn't need the massive, blinding diamonds, the attention of the media, or the harsh glare of the spotlight. I valued stability, competence, and the absolute unyielding safety he represented in a fundamentally, violently unsafe world. He used to say that was my fundamental strength, that I was the quiet, deep-seated calm in his eternal storm, the one quiet, trustworthy harbor he could always, without question, return to for genuine peace. But somewhere along the way, that quietness turned, in his powerful, preoccupied mind, into something he simply took for granted. A predictable, easily dismissed fixture he no longer had to respect or cherish. He started assuming my innate resilience meant actual weakness, that my steady moral strength was just a dull lack of ambition, and that because I didn't join the chorus of women clamoring and demanding his immediate attention, I wouldn't dare demand my ultimate freedom and self-respect when he crossed the line. That night, waiting for him in the deep, chilling dark of the vast living room, the sheer, cavernous scale of the mansion feeling enormous, cold, and utterly empty around me, with the city lights just painting faint, prison-like stripes across the heavy, antique wooden floor, and the deep, heavy, judgmental silence of the place pressing in on my chest. I wasn't dwelling on the raw heartbreak of what I'd lost. That was done, compartmentalized. Instead, I was focused, laser-focused, with a cold clarity that surprised even me, on the vulnerable life growing inside me. A life that deserved far more than a father who only came home when he was completely tired of his fleeting toys and finished with his careless, dangerous games. My fingers, tracing the edge of the unsigned documents on the polished mahogany desk, felt cold, numb, and steady, almost surgical, even though the room was warm, and I vividly remembered that promise we made early on, before the wedding, standing on a windy cliff overlooking the turbulent sea, where he'd promised me, simply and without a shred of visible doubt, that I would always be his priority, his anchor, the one person he would never compromise or put at risk for his empire. Looking at those papers, I realized that his powerful words were only ever going to be as solid as my own meticulously crafted plan to enforce them and protect my own. The waiting, in that silent, oppressive house, was the absolute hardest part of this entire life. The sound of my own shallow, controlled breathing in the immense, echoing silence being the only proof I wasn't just a shadow or a piece of furniture. I had already watched the damning video twice, subjecting myself to the raw, visceral humiliation, confirming the precise location, and, more importantly, confirming the identity of the woman. Serena Vale, the kind of woman whose flawless, surface beauty screams at you, demanding immediate, aggressive attention. The kind of professional model who represents everything this world values: flash, unsustainable surface glamour, and immediate, fleeting gratification, the very embodiment of the superficiality that Damien claimed to despise. When the heavy front door finally clicked open, the sound small but startling in the quiet, even though I had been anticipating it for hours with every fiber of my being, I didn't flinch or move. I remained seated, statuesque, in the deep leather armchair, my hands resting lightly, almost possessively, on the stack of documents. A silent, unmoving sentinel in the oppressive gloom, giving him the power of first observation. When he walked in, his expensive Italian leather shoes making almost no sound on the thick Persian rug, he didn't even notice me right away. His eyes were already fixed, accusingly, on the papers on the desk, and I watched the muscles in his powerful jaw tighten, not in fear or guilt, but in sheer, cold annoyance, as if I were a trivial, predictable inconvenience, a domestic chore he had to finish before getting some well-deserved rest. I had been sitting there, motionless, since exactly 2 a.m, which was the precise time the anonymous video dropped into my secure messaging app. But I had known he wasn't coming home since midnight, when my trusted contact had discreetly notified me that his secure personal line was dead and he hadn't been seen leaving the penthouse suite. 4 months pregnant, and the persistent nausea, which was usually a manageable, low-grade discomfort, coiled suddenly into a painful, crushing knot deep in my stomach, making me clench my teeth so hard my jaw ached just to stay upright and maintain my frozen composure. I didn't flinch, didn't move a single inch, just let the silence stretch out, making the heavy grandfather clock somewhere down the hall seem like the loudest, most judgment thing in the entire room, its pendulum swinging in slow, steady rhythm like a countdown to his demise, until he finally shifted his dark gaze from the documents to my face, forcing himself to acknowledge my presence. I met his eyes across the dark room, and I could physically feel the brokenness swirling deep inside me, that quiet, profound internal shattering that doesn't make a single sound, but changes the entire landscape of your soul forever. It was the defining moment I stopped being just his passive wife, and instantly started being his cold, strategic opponent, ready to leverage his own failures. I had practiced that one single line in my head 100 times, reciting it on the edge of sleep, stripping it ruthlessly of all recognizable emotion, distilling it down to pure, unassailable fact, just to make absolutely certain my voice wouldn't shake or break when I delivered it. He didn't look remotely guilty or apologetic. He looked utterly bored, even vaguely patronizing, as if this were a tiresome script he'd been forced to read 100 times, and that was the moment I truly understood that this whole affair was never about passion or love for him. It was exclusively about possession, convenience, and asserting his own independence, about having the legal wife in the legal house for appearances, while the rest of his life played out elsewhere, without any moral or strategic consequence to him. I watched him shrug off his custom-tailored jacket, a flawless dark silk piece, tossing it carelessly over the back of a priceless antique chair, and that's when the thick, suffocating scent of Serena's specific perfume hit me harder than any punch. That sickeningly sweet, almost metallic fragrance that felt less like a smell and more like a physical slap across my face, stinging my eyes and nearly making me gasp with the sudden, sharp, overpowering nausea that threatened to undo my resolve. That's precisely why I finally spoke. the words coming out low, steady, and utterly devoid of the desperate trembling he probably anticipated and relished, denying him the satisfaction of seeing me hurt. "Sign it," I told him, pushing the documents a fraction of an inch closer across the polished wood of the desk with a fingertip. "I don't have the strength to love a man who always chooses someone else, Damien. That strength is gone now, and that's when he laughed, this short, cold, brutal burst of air that was pure, distilled arrogance, the sound of a man completely assured of his own untouchability, believing he knew my entire moral and financial limit. It was a sound that cut deeper, far deeper than any physical injury or insult could have, because it was delivered with such easy contempt. He walked slowly around the desk, his movements deliberate, controlled, and predatory, like a cat toying with a mouse, leaning down until his large, ominous shadow covered me completely, making me feel physically submerged and drowned in his dark authority and power. I had to physically tilt my head back just to keep looking directly into those dark, impenetrable eyes. But I absolutely refused to break contact or look away, forcing him to engage with the woman he had dismissed. He always used his height and his formidable presence as active weapons, trying to make me feel small and insignificant in his vast world, but I didn't back down an inch. That was the moment he uttered those words, the ones that confirmed everything I feared about his low view of me, his ultimate assumption of my character. "You don't have the courage to leave me, Elena. You're too afraid of what's out there." It was brutal, raw humiliation, proof that he truly thought I was just this fragile, meek little thing. Too weak, too dependent on the Rossi name, too cowardly to ever walk away from the protection and the money that came with the title. He measured courage by the willingness to fight openly, with visible aggression, but I measured it by the willingness to plan meticulously in secret, to outmaneuver the predictable. What he didn't realize, standing there so smugly in the shadow of his own massive conceit, was that those papers weren't about leaving at all. They were about protecting, about building a massive, impenetrable legal wall around the vulnerable future I was carrying, a wall he was about to unknowingly sign into existence, ensuring the safety of our child, whether I stayed, whether he lived, or whether I was eliminated. The actual, legitimate divorce papers were safely filed away with my private, trusted lawyer, waiting for a time when I could initiate the clean break without exposing my true strategic hand. But these documents, meticulously disguised as a standard property settlement and separation agreement, were a massive legal transfer designed by the very best forensic accountants outside of his control. They ensured that if his entire empire, which I knew, thanks to my quiet tracking, was currently hemorrhaging money and under deep, systematic operational pressure from both external rivals and internal instability that he was too distracted to see, imploded completely, the specific assets dedicated to me and our child would be completely untouchable, legally separate from the fallout, and shielded from seizure by the government or by his enemies. My immediate plan was to save my child's future, and in the process, save him from the consequences of his own arrogance and blindness. Now, before I tell you what happened next, because trust me, that long, dark night was just the very, very beginning of a much bigger, much more terrifying storm that engulfed everything, bringing the full weight of the criminal underworld down on my shoulders. I just want to take a necessary deep breath and ask you for a small, simple favor, if you don't mind, as I share this long, exhausting, and often painful story with you. I'm pouring out every single painful, complicated detail of this journey with you, because I want you to know that if you're out there feeling unseen, if you're carrying a heavy, silent burden that everyone else in your life dismisses as nothing or takes for granted, if you've been judged by the clothes you wear or the car you drive, you are fundamentally not alone in this fight. I see you, I respect you, and I truly know how much quiet, relentless strength it takes to keep going every single day when the world is shouting you down. I would really appreciate it, just to know that you're still with me, still listening and leaning into every word. If you could just grab your phone right now, hit that little thumbs up button to like this video, leave me a quick comment below, even just a simple emoji or the 2 earnest words, "I'm here," to acknowledge that quiet battle, and then subscribe to the channel so we can keep walking this difficult, winding journey through the dark together, finding light on the other side. It truly helps me more than you can possibly imagine knowing that this story, which was so agonizingly hard to live through, is actually reaching the people who need to hear it most. The ones who know exactly what it's like to be underestimated and dismissed by a world that values noise over substance. Okay, thank you. I appreciate you deeply. Truly. Now, where were we? Yes, Damien was still standing over me, still laughing at my supposed lack of courage, still smelling of Serena. And I was seconds away from dropping the first truth bomb that he truly never, in his wildest dreams, saw coming. He straightened up then, that cold, unsettling smirk still plastered across his face, a look of utter superiority that made my stomach churn with a deep, quiet disgust that I kept carefully hidden, and he reached confidently for the heavy pen on the desk, assuming I was completely defeated and broken, that I would start pleading or crying the minute he initiated the legal action and made the separation final. He picked up the heavy Mont Blanc, the gold gleaming briefly under the faint ambient light, a deeply symbolic gift he'd received from his late, powerful father, a symbol of the very established power structure he was about to carelessly ignore by signing the documents without reading. And I watched his eyes scan the first page. He wasn't really reading the dense, meticulously crafted legal language I had spent weeks perfecting. He was just quickly registering the bolded, predictable trigger words like division of matrimonial assets and irrevocable trust, words that confirmed his existing expectation of a wife panicking over securing her immediate money, which was a predictable and common tactic in his world. The entire document was a masterpiece of legal misdirection and strategic obfuscation, perfectly disguised, woven seamlessly into the standard, intimidating language of a high-net-worth separation, and he had absolutely no rational reason, given his self-assured mindset and his belief in my simplicity, to suspect anything other than the standard panic of a wife trying to secure her financial future. The truth, however, was far more complex and dangerous than he could ever imagine. I wasn't just filing papers. I had been diligently, silently researching Serena, the little model, for weeks, ever since my gut first tightened with alarm when I saw her name pop up on one of the organization's low-level routine surveillance reports. A report that should have immediately flagged her as a high-risk security breach, but hadn't, which was the first huge, screaming red flag that someone high up in Damien's trusted security circle was deliberately and methodically obscuring her background check and protecting her dangerous access to the family. My own quiet, solitary, self-funded investigation, conducted through accessing dusty, decades-old financial records stored in obscure archives, leveraging low-level contacts who owed my family small, forgotten favors from my humble childhood, and the kind of meticulous, painstaking cross-referencing only someone who has nothing else to do but sit and worry about the impending doom can pull off, led me straight to the shocking, undeniable discovery. Serena wasn't just a pretty distraction, a fleeting moment of marital weakness he could easily discard. She had direct, provable, and systematic financial and operational ties to Il Sordo, the very ruthless enemy Damien was fighting tooth and nail in the darkest shadows, the man who wanted to watch the entire, carefully constructed Rossi empire burn completely to the ground, taking Damien, his legacy, and his child with it. That initial video I sent to myself, the one that gave the calculated appearance of a wife finally cracking under the pressure of his infidelity, was the final, critical, necessary test. I needed to see if he would even try to lie or cover up about where he was, or if he was so deeply entrenched and secure in his affair that he would just steamroll me, completely oblivious to the existential, life-threatening danger Serena posed to his life and his family's future. His cold reaction, his predictable, arrogant assumption of my intrinsic weakness, that was just all the confirmation I needed. He was blind to the internal threat. Not because he was stupid or incompetent in business, but because his ego and his inherited, deep-seated trauma had completely convinced him he was untouchable and could see every threat coming from a mile away. He was being played like a cheap fiddle, seduced into a classic honey trap designed to drain sensitive operational information and create deep, destabilizing chaos in his home life, weakening his focus at the absolute worst possible time for the organization. I had to expose the trap immediately, but I couldn't risk revealing the true extent of my knowledge, because if his enemies knew I was tracking them, they would simply eliminate me and the child without a second thought. So, I pushed the papers and waited for him to sign the massive legal transfer, the document that would protect my child's future even if I was killed or he was deposed. He signed the first page, his signature a careless, angry scribble that was more of a lash out than a commitment. And then he looked up, a cloud of impatient irritation already back in his eyes. "Finished?" he asked, tossing the pen back down onto the desk with a clatter, still utterly unaware that he had just ceded massive, irrevocable, protected control of critical assets to me, assets that were now beyond his reach. I didn't answer him right away. I let the massive, dramatic irony of the moment hang thick and heavy in the air for a long, pregnant second, using the pause to compose the final, devastating blow. Then I simply tilted my head slightly, mirroring the casual arrogance he had shown me moments before, and I said, in that same low, steady, unwavering voice that allowed absolutely no room for debate or confusion, "Serena Vale is not a model, Damien. She's a highly placed operative for Il Sordo, and you just signed a document that prevents him from seizing assets that are now completely outside the legal reach of the Rossi organization, assets that you just transferred to me." The sudden, sharp, catastrophic shock that hit his face was immediate, profound, and profoundly satisfying to my broken heart. The color drained right out, leaving his olive skin sickly pale, and his mouth, which had been set in that condescending smirk, went completely slack with disbelief, his eyes widening in pure, raw terror and dawning comprehension. He stared, completely frozen, at the documents, then back at me, his powerful body suddenly rigid with a tension that was miles beyond mere marital discord or anger. This was the tension of a cornered, powerful animal, realizing the walls are closing in, and that the trap was set by the one person he deemed insignificant. "What in God's name are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice dropping instantly to a dangerous, barely contained primal growl, the kind that usually sent armed men running for cover. But I just held my ground, meeting his terrifying intensity with my own quiet, surgical resolve. I didn't flinch, didn't even blink, and I made sure he saw no fear in my eyes, only the cold, hard certainty of fact. I watched him scramble, his large hands reaching quickly, frantically, for the stack of documents, his eyes tearing through the pages, finally, frantically, realizing that the dense legal language he'd carelessly ignored was actually a carefully crafted, life-saving legal landmine designed by me, his dismissed wife. He grabbed the documents, his large, imposing hands shaking violently and visibly as he finally started to read, really read, the microscopic, technical print, the specific sections I had painstakingly highlighted with my own pen late that night when he was with her. He ran his eyes over the specific clauses concerning the heir's irrevocable contingency trust, and the complete legal separation of the matrimonial asset pool from the operational holdings. A separation designed to look like a greedy wife's demand, but was actually a perfectly executed firewall against the seizure of assets by his enemies or the government. That's when the full weight of the realization hit him with the force of a tidal wave. The bitter, agonizing irony of the betrayal not being a wife leaving him, but a wife moving complex, high-stakes chess pieces he didn't even know were on the board, pieces that were now suddenly in check and protecting his life. His eyes snapped up to mine, blazing now with a mixture of confusion, utter awe, and pure, unadulterated, humbled shock that quickly turned into something like deep respect for my capabilities and my loyalty. "Elena, you played me? You set me up with that video?" he whispered, the question hanging heavy, thick, and accusatory between us. A raw, painful admission that the quiet little wife he thought he controlled and dismissed had just orchestrated a major strategic, financial, and organizational move right under his nose, exposing his entire security and emotional failure. I stood up then, pushing my chair back slowly, deliberately, placing my hands gently and firmly on the desk. the movement slow and measured. A final physical manifestation of my control and my new, unshakable boundary in that terrifying moment. I looked him dead in the eye. That shattered heart of mine quieted now by a surge of cold, focused determination that felt more potent and more protective than any love I had ever known. No, I corrected him. Just two perfectly chosen syllables, calm, precise and absolute in their certainty. You put yourself in a position to lose. I merely ensured that when you lost, our child wouldn't lose everything too. He was stunned, absolutely stunned, speechless and reeling, and I knew right then that the dynamics of our marriage and the future of the Rossi family had irrevocably changed forever, because he finally understood, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that I was not a woman who crumbled under pressure. I was a woman who prepared for war and executed the plan flawlessly, protecting his life and his line when he could not protect himself. The immediate aftermath of that night was messy, confusing, and intensely stressful. A perpetual low, persistent hum of unresolved conflict and distrust that filled every single corner of the vast, cold mansion, replacing the prior silence with a deafening tension. Damien was scrambling desperately to contain the massive operational damage, quietly moving assets and personnel, trying to find the deep holes in his security apparatus that Serena had so effortlessly exploited, all the while knowing, in the back of his mind, that I had seen what his mighty, expensive intelligence network had completely missed. He began subtly questioning his own people, watching their reactions. But he never asked for my help again, only demanding my ongoing information. The man was still too proud to admit his dependence. He still slept in the master suite, a tense, silent, deeply uncomfortable arrangement that felt far more like sharing a prison cell than a marital bedroom, where we occupied the same space but lived in different, hostile worlds. But we spoke only in tense, clipped, transactional sentences, entirely focused on damage control, security protocols, legal maneuvers, and intelligence reports. Never once about the child or the crushing infidelity that had started it all, as if discussing those things would break the fragile truce. But outside the house, Serena, fully believing she had driven a permanent, irreparable wedge between us, and successfully made Damien even more emotionally vulnerable by sowing chaos, was having an absolute field day, reveling in the public attention and his forced indifference to me. The humiliation game she played was vicious, calculated, and entirely public within our closed world, designed not just to hurt me emotionally, but to completely delegitimize my place in the ancient, rigid Rossi family structure, to make me a pathetic joke among the other powerful wives and girlfriends who police the boundaries of this insular, privileged, and deeply cruel world. It started subtly, like a slow-moving digital infection that spread through the dark web, a trickle of anonymous, intimate photos of her and Damien leaking onto the closed, high-security social media feeds that the Mafia families used. Not public platforms, but the dark, encrypted, highly restricted channels where status was everything and gossip was weaponized currency. The photos were always carefully curated, showing Damien looking happy, relaxed, making it clear he was actively choosing her in intimate moments. And the poisonous whispers started immediately. Little comments under the posts hinting that Elena was simply the abandoned little wife, the one who was necessary only for the legal lineage, but utterly irrelevant to the man himself and the future of the empire. She made sure the photos surfaced and peaked just before the annual, massive underground gala, a high-stakes networking event where every family boss and their spouse was present, and status was judged ruthlessly by the sheen of your dress, the quality of your entourage, and the cold, unyielding hardness in your eyes. I showed up in a simple, high-necked gown, not a designer label but perfectly tailored to accommodate the 4-month bump that was becoming impossible to hide. And Serena, of course, was there. A shimmering vision in a dress that looked like liquid gold, draped possessively on the arm of one of Damien's primary rivals, a man she was now clearly using as a secondary vector to get at him and further cement her organizational betrayal, standing openly as a testament to Damien's poor judgment. I tried desperately to ignore her, clinging to the edge of the cavernous, oppressively opulent room sipping ice water and fighting off the constant, dizzying waves of morning sickness that plagued me all day. But she zeroed in on me like a predator smelling wounded blood. The gala itself was a symphony of excess. Gold leaf on every molding, heavy velvet drapes that suffocated the air, and the sickly sweet scent of hundreds of expensive perfumes mixing with cigar smoke, as Damien was distracted by a crucial, tense conversation with the capo of the powerful Bologna family, a conversation I knew was about an imminent arms deal. Serena glided up, moving like a snake through the crowded room, her specific perfume, that sickeningly sweet, metallic scent, suffocating me in the close quarters and triggering my nausea instantly. She leaned in close, her perfect, full lips barely moving, whispering right into my ear, her voice dripping with artificial, saccharine sympathy that was pure mockery. "Nice belly, Elena. Good for breeding, I suppose. It's what you were hired for." But he chose me, didn't he? When it mattered, when he needed real passion, he always leaves you alone to carry the heavy load and maintain the fiction. The sting of the words was immediate and intense, and I could feel the hot flush rising in my cheeks and down my neck. But I simply nodded once, giving her absolutely nothing to work with. And then I slowly, deliberately walked away, needing clean, cold air to fight the rising panic. That was my only visible reaction, a quiet, almost imperceptible retreat. But the damage was done. The message delivered. All around the ballroom, I could hear the sharp, quick snickers of the Mafia wives, the ones whose whole identity was tied up in their husband's unwavering public loyalty, and their muttered words cut deeper than any knife. "A legal wife? She's a boring burden, not worth as much as the boss's favorite toy. She's too plain, too quiet. She doesn't belong here." Their dismissal was palpable, a suffocating blanket of vicious, classist judgment that tried to push me back into the poverty I came from. The sheer volume of their collective disdain, combined with the heavy, humid air of the crowded, overheated room, the aggressive, loud music, and the overwhelming stress of the situation, finally became too much for my pregnant body to handle. I felt a sudden, dizzying, crushing wave of nausea crash over me, and the entire room tilted violently and dangerously, the polished marble floor swaying under my feet. I reached out quickly, my hand grasping for the cool, solid support of a nearby marble column. The coldness a brief shock against my skin, trying desperately to keep my breathing even and shallow. But the room was spinning uncontrollably, the noise too loud and echoing, the smells of perfume and expensive wine too intensely suffocating. I was fighting for my dignity, fighting to stay conscious, fighting to just make it to a safe chair without making a complete, public spectacle, when Serena's voice, now pitched just loud enough for the entire group of powerful, gossiping women to hear and witness my degradation, sliced through my agony like a razor blade. She had followed me, determined to savor every agonizing moment of my pain. "Pathetic," she announced, her voice filled with mock pity that was far worse than outright cruelty. She stepped closer, invading my space. "Look at her. She can't even stand on her own 2 feet without collapsing. What use is a wife who is so demonstrably weak and fragile, especially when the family is under attack? She is a liability." I closed my eyes, focused entirely on the sharp, cool, anchoring pressure of the marble against my palm, clinging to it like a lifeline, trying to find my strength. And I waited for Damien to stride quickly over, to interrupt his conversation, to simply put a protective hand on my shoulder and tell them all to back off and mind their own business. But he didn't. He stood there, about 20 feet away, locked in his conversation with the capo, his back completely to me, his focus absolute on business, and his silence, his failure to defend me in that crucial public moment of physical distress, was the single most humiliating and heartbreaking blow of the entire evening. It wasn't the cruelty of those women that broke me and made me feel small. It was his quiet, public indifference, his implied agreement with their judgment, his choice to prioritize an arms deal over his wife and unborn child. His silence gave them all the permission they needed to continue, and it solidified Serena's belief that I was utterly disposable, a a fact she planned to leverage to the absolute maximum in her slow, systematic infiltration of the family structure. But that deliberate, profound silence, that public, momentary abandonment, was, ironically, the greatest strategic gift he could have given me, because it convinced Serena that her strategy was working perfectly, and that I was completely incapacitated, a broken doll too consumed by nausea and shame and betrayal to pose any kind of threat. I allowed her to believe I was weak, disappearing almost entirely from public life for a few critical weeks, claiming the debilitating pregnancy was taking a harder toll than expected, which gave me the perfect, unassailable cover to execute the next, critical phase of my plan without suspicion. I knew, thanks to my earlier investigation, that Serena was receiving significant, clandestine funding, but I couldn't expose her immediately without simultaneously exposing my deep network of outside, loyal contacts, so I had to meticulously set up a situation to force her to expose herself to the network. I used the very same underground encrypted media channels she was using to humiliate me, but I used them to spread a different kind of rumor. A very specific, financial one, I hinted, with painstaking, lawyerly precision and complex jargon that sounded utterly legitimate, at a supposed massive, systemic operational oversight in the money laundering operations of a smaller, rival family, one who was actually completely loyal to Damien, but whose books were notoriously opaque and easy to frame. This financial rumor involved a complex series of false transactions concerning a shell company in the Cayman Islands that I fabricated, making it appear as though the rival family was skimming and leaving a glaring, exploitable loophole. The true goal wasn't to hurt the loyal family, but to force Il Sordo, Serena's controller, to move money immediately, quickly, and defensively to shore up what they believed was a newly discovered, critically vulnerable asset before the authorities or other rivals noticed. The reaction was almost instantaneous, and exactly as calculated. The money was moved swiftly and defensively, creating a traceable path that I was waiting for, and Serena, acting on what she thought was a hot, exclusive tip from her deep access and desperate to prove her worth and efficacy to Il Sordo, rushed to publicly defend the supposed vulnerable family's financial operations on those same private feeds, seeking to reassure the worried bosses. In her arrogance and haste, she not only defended the operation, but accidentally revealed a single, critical, defining piece of data, a unique account identification number associated with a specific off-book ledger, that inadvertently exposed the entire, complex money trail linking the rival family to Il Sordo's own direct funding. It was a digital breadcrumb, a small, highly technical detail about an offshore holding company's registration date that only someone with direct, recent, privileged access to Il Sordo's most private books and data could possibly have known. My covert investigation immediately jumped on the clue, running complex forensic accounting software through the newly exposed path. And within 72 hours, I had acquired the smoking gun, incontrovertible, provable, and legally sound evidence. Serena Vale wasn't just tied to Il Sordo. She was one of his primary, highly compensated financial conduits, receiving massive, regular payments that were directly traceable to his most sensitive, high-level operations. And she was the one who had intentionally created the security breach within the Rossi network. The shock on Damien's face when I presented the findings, not casually on my personal laptop, but printed out, bound in heavy professional cardstock, and stamped with the impressive seals of 3 separate, reputable international law firms and 1 specialized forensic accounting agency, was profoundly different this time. It wasn't confusion or simple anger. It was a slow, dawning, deeply humbling comprehension mixed with absolute awe and a dawning understanding of my true capabilities, an understanding that completely overshadowed my humble origins. He had been so utterly focused on external, visible threats, on guns, territorial disputes, and rival bosses, that he had completely missed the quiet, meticulous, long-term threat operating right under his own duvet. A threat that only a woman with nothing to do but watch, worry, and plan could possibly uncover. The true twist, the one that made his hands tremble as he looked at the documents and slowly absorbed the magnitude of my planning, was the discovery that my team, operating with the information I had meticulously gleaned from Serena's blunder, had also quietly tipped off a small, specialized unit of undercover agents within the government, agents Damien himself thought he controlled, but who were only truly loyal to the safety of the entire family structure. And this tip had led directly to the interception of a major arms shipment from Il Sordo, saving a crucial Rossi operation from a catastrophic, potentially empire-ending ambush. I had successfully acted weak and broken, but in reality, I had not only exposed his enemy, but had saved him from total destruction. He finally understood that he had underestimated me not because of my background, but because of his own ego. The climax of this phase, the moment of my public and irrefutable vindication, came at the large, formal gathering of the entire extended Rossi family. The annual event where the internal power dynamics and hierarchy are always subtly reaffirmed and cemented. It was an intensely tense event, full of judging eyes and whispered vicious speculation about the catastrophic state of our marriage and the ultimate truth about Serena, who was now suddenly and inexplicably missing from the social circuit. I stood quietly and demurely by Damien's side, my stomach now noticeably rounder and more prominent, my expression serene and unreadable, having given him a very brief, almost imperceptible nod before we entered the room. A nod that meant, "I'm with you publicly, but I am still watching every move you make." He deliberately let the tension build for what felt like an eternity, allowing every single person in the room to make their final judgment. To assume I was still the disgraced, discarded wife he was simply obligated to tolerate in public. Then he raised his expensive crystal glass, and the room, as always when the Don speaks, fell into a complete and utter silence, the sound of the glass tapping the fork reverberating through the marble hall. He didn't offer a toast to power, or to conquest, or to the future of the family. Instead, he looked directly at me, and his eyes, for the first time in months, held something far more complex than respect. It was deep gratitude, mixed with a chilling, dawning fear of my capabilities. He looked down momentarily at the documents I had placed in his hand the week before, the ones that meticulously outlined my work, and he spoke clearly, his powerful voice echoing and resonating in the marble hall, silencing every detractor. This family survives today, my cousins, my brothers, my friends, because of Elena. Her eyes saw what mine did not. It was more than an announcement. It was a public, irrefutable vindication, and a strategic declaration of loyalty, a binding statement he could not retract. He didn't explain why or how I had achieved this. He just gave me credit. And in this ruthless world, that public credit was more valuable and protective than any apology or financial settlement could ever be, cementing my unassailable position as the family's true protector. He was publicly acknowledging that I had always watched from afar, and that my quiet strength and attention to detail had seen what his mighty power and arrogance couldn't. The true enemy, positioned for the kill in the very heart of his home. Of course, in this world of perpetual conflict, victory is never permanent. It is merely the cue for the next, more brutal, more personal attack. Il Sordo, now wounded, exposed, and deeply humiliated, realized that I was the unexpected, uncontrollable variable, the single piece on the board they hadn't accounted for. And they doubled down on the most personal, most destructive form of warfare possible. Psychological destruction aimed at the very bloodline. The rumors started subtly, then exploded like a timed charge across the entire network, infiltrating every single family, every dinner table, and every private conversation. Whispers, now backed by the weight of their organization's spreading, poisonous influence, that the baby I was carrying, the heir Damien had just publicly acknowledged and protected, wasn't actually his. The poison spread faster than wildfire, twisting Damien's public affirmation of me into irrefutable proof of my supposed cunning and deceit. The ugly, calculated story they wove was horrific, designed to strike at the foundation of his inherited status. Elena, the humble girl, had married for status, and now, sensing the family's wealth was at severe risk, she had secured her position by having a calculated affair with a high-level rival, planning all along to pass off the enemy's child as the rightful Rossi heir. A scheme designed to steal the entire fortune and bring down the family from within its own bloodline, turning the family's strength into its greatest weakness. The reaction from the other, heavily judgmental Mafia families was immediate and chillingly unanimous, especially among the older women who guarded the bloodlines. They began to openly shun me at every opportunity, their eyes filled with utter contempt and suspicion, their words sharper and more casual than ever before. I went from being the quiet, unassuming wife to a scheming woman trying to steal the Rossi fortune in the blink of an eye, the change in public perception being breathtakingly swift and total. They actually relished the drama, the potential collapse of the powerful Rossi dynasty, and they judged me mercilessly, seeing my reserved, quiet nature as definitive proof of a cold, calculating, deceptive mind that was far more dangerous than any outward flashiness. The worst, most painful part of all this was watching the doubt take root, slowly and inexorably, in Damien's weary, battle-worn eyes. He had just publicly backed me, risked his formidable reputation for me. But this new rumor, this ancient, primal fear of paternity that speaks to the insecurity of all-powerful men, struck a chord that went deep into the heart of his inherited trauma. I knew, intimately, the full story of how his own mother had betrayed his father in a horrific, public, organizational way. A fundamental betrayal that had scarred his entire worldview and taught him never ever to truly trust intimacy or loyalty from a woman. This rumor hit that deep, open wound with surgical, devastating precision, undermining all the rational evidence I had provided and leaving him vulnerable only to his deepest fears. I was in his massive, dimly lit study late one evening, reviewing security reports that showed increased activity around the coastal properties, something I had been doing regularly, almost as a silent, continuous way of showing my utility and unyielding loyalty, when the heavy mahogany door slammed open with a violent force that shook the room, and Damien walked in, his face a horrifying mask of pure, black rage, a rage far darker and more consuming than the one I had seen the night I presented the legal papers, because this was personal. This was about blood. He wasn't yelling. He was seething, barely containing a volcanic fury that made the very air crackle with dangerous energy, and his whole body was shaking with an intensity that terrified me, not just for myself, but for him. He grabbed a heavy crystal tumbler full of amber whiskey from his desk, the glass sparkling briefly in the low light, and, with a sudden, unthinking, violent movement fueled by pure, uncontrolled desperation, he smashed it against the cold, stone fireplace mantel. The sound was absolutely deafening, the expensive glass shattering into a million sharp, glittering shards that scattered across the polished floor, a deliberate act of destruction aimed at relieving internal pressure. And I flinched, not in raw fear of him, but in deep, profound sorrow for the immense, self-destructive pain he was trying desperately to exorcise, a pain that consumed him wholly. The act was meant to shock me, to make me recoil and fear him. But I just watched him, my expression steady, sorrowful and unmoving, waiting for the devastating storm to pass. He stood there panting heavily, his knuckles white and rigid, his chest heaving. And then he slowly leveled his gaze at me, the question in his eyes, the unspoken, agonizing accusation, being more painful and cutting than the glass shards on the floor. I didn't defend myself with facts or desperate denials. I didn't move an inch, just letting my vulnerability be my only defense. Instead, I whispered, my voice barely audible above the ringing silence, thick with the heartache of seeing his trust completely evaporate once more. You really think I betrayed you, Damien? After everything I have done? I wanted him to see my soul, to see the sheer, logical impossibility of the entire accusation. But his ancestral scars were simply too deep and too raw for reason to penetrate, and the dark whispers of Il Sordo had reached him too effectively. He took a long, cold, measured breath, the anger hardening back into a cruel, protective indifference that was worse than any rage, and his reply was the single most devastating, defining thing he had ever said to me in our entire relationship. The sentence that erased all the good moments and solidified my need to leave. This world taught me, he said, his voice flat, brutal and utterly final. Every woman lies, and you, Elena, have proven you are the most dangerous kind of liar. That sentence was the absolute end of the line for me. Not the end of my quiet fight to protect my child, but the immediate, definitive end of my tolerance for his paralyzing emotional cruelty and his stubborn inability to trust the one person who had actually saved him. I walked out of the study without another word, my heart completely hollowed out and empty, and went straight to the best private medical facility I could access, the one completely outside the family network and any of its known influences, a facility I had vetted months earlier for this exact crisis. I didn't just defend myself with words, I demanded a full, legally binding DNA test, initiated by me and paid for entirely through my separate, legally protected accounts. I walked into the secure lab, submitted the necessary samples with a cold, clear, businesslike mind, and made it explicitly clear to the head technician that I wanted the results delivered not just to the family doctor, the compromised man on Damien's payroll, but simultaneously to 3 independent external lawyers, all of whom had standing with the highest levels of the law and whose integrity even the powerful Rossi family had to respect and fear. I was utterly unafraid because I knew the simple, unwavering truth. My loyalty to my child, and honestly, my loyalty to the legacy I had signed up to protect, was absolute and pure. I went home and waited, allowing the final, poisonous rumors to swirl around the mansion like a deadly fog, knowing that the real truth would soon arrive like an unavoidable thunderclap, changing everything, but knowing also that Il Sordo was still active. But Il Sordo, realizing the DNA test was my brilliant countermove to neutralize their psychological weapon, was 2 critical steps ahead, anticipating my every action and the timing of the delivery. They didn't rely on rumors anymore. They acted with swift, professional malice, compromising the delivery chain. When the highly anticipated results finally arrived at the mansion, delivered in a securely sealed, official-looking envelope by a panicked courier, they weren't the real, honest results at all. Il Sordo had expertly tampered with the sample chain of custody during transit, swapped the critical documentation with high-quality forgeries, and engineered the result to read definitively, "Not Damien's child," signed by the compromised family doctor who was too afraid of the family's rage to speak the truth. The very moment the family doctor, the weak man whose loyalty was bought and whose integrity was non-existent, read the official, shocking verdict aloud in the main hall, the entire house erupted into catastrophic chaos, the sound of horrified gasps and furious yells echoing off the marble. The network of women who had already judged me descended like hungry, shrieking vultures, screaming about my unbelievable deceit, demanding my immediate public expulsion from the family home and the family name. Certain they had been proven right about the girl from the wrong side of the tracks, Damien, seeing the official, stamped documents that appeared to confirm his deepest, most agonizing fear, stood completely paralyzed, his authority draining away on the marble floor. He was a man whose entire life and empire was built on control and objective truth, and now he was faced with what he believed was irrefutable, legal proof of a calculated generational betrayal that would instantly ruin him and his house. And this time, he was too broken to fight the evidence. I was treated instantly like a pariah, a traitor of the highest, most dangerous order. My small, humble bag, containing the few belongings I still cared about, was packed quickly and roughly by the terrified house staff. Not by me, as I refused to acknowledge the action, and I was physically, humiliatingly dragged out of the Rossi mansion, still only 6 months pregnant. The humiliation complete and total. A public spectacle for the entire staff and guard contingent to witness. The rough hands of the guards dug into my arms, pulling me forward. I didn't fight them physically. I didn't resist the rough hands on my arms, refusing to give them the struggle they wanted or the satisfaction of my screams. I let their hands drag me, not because I was weak, but because I knew I needed to look exactly like the disgraced liar they all thought I was, a broken thing they could dismiss and forget, a piece of trash easily swept out the door. As they pulled me past the entrance hall, past the scattered, glittering remnants of the crystal glass still lying near the fireplace, a silent reminder of his rage. I looked one last time at Damien. He was standing motionless on the grand staircase, watching the entire agonizing scene unfold, his face devoid of all emotion. A terrifying blank slate of tortured, unforgivable silence. He didn't stop them. He didn't lift a single protective finger to defend me. He simply let me be dragged out the heavy front door, out of the security of the family home, and into the open, deadly, waiting arms of the world he was supposed to protect me from, a world that was now hunting me. That night, lying alone in the cheap, secure motel room I had arranged weeks earlier just in case, nestled far away from the city's reach, I felt the cold, crushing realization that my massive sacrifice, my year of silent vigilance and painstaking planning, had been for absolutely nothing. I had successfully protected the assets, but I had decisively lost the man and the life I had worked to secure, and now I was a target. What I didn't know was that Damien's tortured silence hadn't lasted more than 5 minutes after the front door closed behind me and the guards left. The instant he was alone, the cold, calculated, strategically brilliant part of his brain kicked back in, violently overriding his emotional trauma and inherited fear. He looked at the forged documents one more time, and some infinitesimal detail, the type font on the footer, the quality of the seal being slightly blurred, the sheer convenience of the result, didn't feel right, triggering his professional paranoia. He immediately called in his private, untraceable investigative unit, the one even his father didn't know existed, his ultimate check and balance, and demanded a full forensic review of the entire DNA process, the custody chain, and the documentation, authorizing unlimited resources. By the time the sun came up over the city, casting long, accusing shadows, Damien had his terrifying, undeniable answer. The real DNA results had been professionally intercepted and swapped by high-level enemies, and the paperwork he had acted upon was a masterful, calculated forgery designed to ruin him and separate him from his true heir. The truth hit him like a physical blow, a sudden, blinding awareness of his monumental, unforgivable mistake. The baby was 100% his rightful son, the legitimate heir, and the woman he had just violently thrown out of his house, the one he had allowed to be humiliated and dragged into the street by his own staff, was the only person who had ever been truly, absolutely loyal to him and his family, and he had abandoned her to the wolves. The moment he realized the baby was his, and that Il Sordo had played him expertly by exploiting his deepest, most crippling trauma, the entire geopolitical game of the underworld instantly changed from a subtle power struggle to a desperate, lethal hunt for survival. Il Sordo, believing they had successfully destabilized the powerful Rossi family by eliminating the heir and the wife, now saw me as a dangerous loose end, a witness who knew too much and needed to be silenced permanently before I could expose their high-level forgery. Worse, they still feared I held some final trump card. Maybe the original, untampered DNA report. Maybe the proof of their forgery. And they needed to eliminate me for good before I could reveal the depth of their manipulation. They started hunting me immediately and ruthlessly, tracking the rental car I had used to flee. I was in a small, battered rental car, driving frantically through a sudden, heavy, torrential downpour, the wipers struggling uselessly against the water, trying desperately to reach a neutral safe house I had secured weeks earlier near the coast. When I saw the familiar, menacing silhouette of the black SUVs in my rearview mirror, their headlights slicing through the rain like yellow eyes. Panic seized me, the kind that steals your breath and makes your mind go momentarily blank with sheer terror. I swerved violently, trying to lose them in the narrow, winding back roads of the Italian countryside, pushing the little car far past its limits. But they were too close, too numerous, and far too skilled at the chase, forcing me off the road. The physical strain of the high-speed chase, the sheer, unrelenting terror, combined with the extreme emotional stress of the past catastrophic weeks, finally broke my 6-month pregnant body. My belly, taut and stretched to its limit, suddenly clenched in a sharp, painful, seizing contraction. Not the gentle, early ones I was used to, but a deep, seizing, bone-crushing pain that made me cry out and slam instinctively on the brakes. Early labor. My vision blurred violently with the pain and the heavy, blurring rain hitting the windshield, and I knew, with sickening finality, that I was completely cornered and exposed. I barely had time to scramble clumsily out of the car, my movements slow and agonizing due to the pain, trying to run toward the meager cover of a dense copse of trees, before their heavy, intimidating figures were instantly on me, grabbing me like prey. They grabbed me, the shock of their rough, brutal hands on my body making me dizzy and weak, and the pain in my stomach was now a searing, continuous, unrelenting fire. They didn't hit me, they simply held me captive, their cold goal not physical harm, but the psychological torture designed to crush my spirit and taunt Damien one last fatal time. The ultimate, final betrayal came when I saw Serena. She stepped calmly out of the lead SUV, no longer the glamorous, soft model, but a cold, hard, ruthless operative. Her face set in a triumphant, icy sneer, oblivious to her own captured status by my team. She pulled out a small, specialized camera and began to live-stream my capture. A final, public taunt meant to crush Damien completely and irrevocably, destroying him emotionally before the final hit. The agony in my belly was overwhelming, relentless, and I was sobbing uncontrollably, the raw, animal sound of my fear echoing uselessly in the rain. I cried out his name, not in hope, but in final, complete despair. "Damien won't come!" I screamed into the downpour, the words torn from me by the combined, crushing pain of the contractions and the utter magnitude of the betrayal. Serena watched me, her eyes glittering with sick, cold satisfaction. She walked up to me and, without a word, delivered a sharp, open-handed slap across my face, the sound cutting through the rain. It was cruel, unnecessary, and designed purely for the viewing audience. "You're just a pawn, little Elena," she spat, her voice cold and utterly venomous, leaning in close so the mic could pick up her words. "Damien let you get dragged out of his house like trash. He will absolutely let you die here, abandoned and alone, because he chooses power over loyalty, every single time." That slap, that final, vicious broadcast act of humiliation, was the exact, perfect trigger Damien needed. I later heard the graphic story from the few men who were with him, how he was watching the live feed, the horrible video of his wife, 6 months pregnant with his only son, sobbing uncontrollably in the rain while the enemy's operative mocked her and prepared to deliver the killing blow. That horrific image, the sight of my tear-streaked, bruised face and Serena's cruel sneer, snapped something deep inside him, something primal and unbreakable, finally shattering his inherited trauma and unleashing the pure predator. The cold, calculated Mafia boss, the man who never showed emotion or weakness, went completely, terrifyingly berserk. He didn't issue cold, strategic orders. He moved, reacting purely on instinct, a force of nature unleashed. He grabbed the first machine gun he saw, threw on a heavy tactical vest, and tore out of the house, his entire security detail scrambling desperately to follow a man who had completely lost all semblance of control for the first time in his life. He didn't drive. He flew, taking his personal armored vehicle and driving it straight through security roadblocks, ignoring every protocol, every caution, every call on the radio, single-mindedly focused on my location, guided only by the GPS feed from Serena's broadcast. He hit Il Sordo's safe house, the derelict, forgotten warehouse where they had dragged me, like a terrifying, unstoppable human wrecking ball, crashing the armored vehicle straight through the front gate. The ensuing slaughter was brutal, total, and terrifying in its speed and intensity. He wasn't a boss issuing precise commands. He was a hurricane of pure, unadulterated rage, killing every man in his path with an efficiency born of desperation, his movements fueled solely by the desperate, primal, all-consuming need to save his wife and child, screaming my name over the roar of the gunfire. I was lying in a corner, my breathing shallow, the massive contractions coming fast and hard, when the door burst open and he stood there, framed by the chaos and the flashing emergency lights of the city outside, a silhouette of vengeance. He was covered in blood that wasn't his his expensive clothes torn and filthy, his face a wild, unrecognizable mask of horror, fury, and love, seeing only me. Serena, realizing the tables had turned instantly and catastrophically, tried desperately to flee, scrambling over debris. But she didn't make it to the door. She was intercepted, not by Damien, but by the quiet, efficient Italian mafia operatives I had secretly kept on standby, the ones who were monitoring Il Sordo's known hideouts, based on my past intel. They handled her, cleanly, professionally, and entirely out of my sight and without my involvement. Damien rushed to me, dropping the gun clattering loudly to the floor, finally prioritizing my life over the weapon that represented his power. He knelt down, his large hands trembling violently as he gently cradled my head, and seeing him like that, completely stripped of his power, reduced to pure, agonizing fear and vulnerability, was almost as shocking as the pain I was in. He carefully lifted my mud-caked body into his arms, ignoring the blood and the filth, holding my heavy body tightly against his chest, and he started whispering. A broken, desperate litany of apologies and pleas that poured from him uncontrollably. I was wrong, Elena. I was so wrong. I should have never doubted you. I should have protected you from them. Please, please don't leave me now. He was shaking uncontrollably, raw, genuine tears streaming down his face. The first time I had ever seen him cry. A raw, gut-wrenching sound that tore at my heart even through the dense haze of my agony. I looked up at him, the pain washing over me in relentless, blinding waves, and the words I choked out weren't about forgiveness or love. They were a final, desperate plea for recognition, for him to understand the true, devastating depth of his initial failure to trust me. Don't let me die in your hands again, Damien, I sobbed, the words meaning, don't let your distrust, your inherited mistake, kill me this time. Don't let your coldness cost me my life. The scene descended into a final, terrifying, cataclysmic chaos. I went into full, active, agonizing labor right there, in the middle of a dirty, dimly lit warehouse floor, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder, sweat, and blood. There was absolutely no doctor, no safety, and definitely no anesthesia. Just the cold, hard, filthy ground and the sound of distant, sporadic gunfire outside as the last pockets of Il Sordo's men were rounded up and neutralized. Damien was completely, utterly lost, his immense power useless, his strength irrelevant in the face of this natural, unstoppable force. He held me, his face pale with utter panic, and he was screaming my name, crying like a child, completely unable to help me as I screamed from the searing pain of the final contractions. Every time I thought I couldn't possibly bear it anymore, a new wave would hit me. A monstrous contraction that stole my breath and made my vision tunnel into nothing but white-hot agony. Suddenly, Il Sordo's massive, last-ditch backup, a contingent of hundreds of armed mercenaries, surrounded the warehouse, ready to shoot to kill. Realizing this was their final, desperate chance to take out the hated Rossi heir, Damien looked up, his face a study in utter despair and complete helplessness, realizing he had saved me only to die with me and our child. The pain was too much. The world went silent, and I felt a horrifying rush of warmth as I fainted, bleeding heavily in his arms, the last thing I saw being the raw, tormented, unmasked fear in my husband's eyes as he stared at the woman he had abandoned only days before. The logical part of my mind, the part that was still stubbornly fighting, knew this was it. We were going to die, and the Empire would fall with us. But Damien made a monumental choice in that final, split-second moment, a choice that finally, irrevocably revealed the true, deeply hidden man beneath the monster. He saw the doors, the dark shadows of the approaching enemy, and he looked down at my pale, unconscious face, and the life clinging desperately inside me. He dropped his gun, the weapon that was supposed to protect him, but which had also made him cold, blind, and cruel, letting it clatter onto the bloody floor with a loud clang. He raised his hands, a gesture of absolute, total surrender to the moment and to his love. A clear, unmistakable declaration that money, power, and violence were all utterly irrelevant now. He shouted, his voice ringing with a conviction that cut through the noise of the approaching enemy, carrying a tone of finality. If I die with my family. It was a final, desperate admission that his family, me and the child, were the only things that truly, fundamentally mattered. And then, a bizarre, almost miraculous thing happened that defied all the logic of the brutal world we lived in. As the gunfire outside intensified and the walls seemed about to collapse, a small door I had never noticed opened quietly, and a diminutive, calm-faced woman, dressed impeccably in the scrubs of a specialized obstetrician, stepped calmly into the room. It was the mysterious doctor I had secretly hired months ago, placing her discreetly in a safe spot near the coast, preparing her for exactly this kind of emergency. A contingency I never ever told Damien about. She was my final card, my last unrevealed act of protection for our child. She didn't panic. She simply commanded Damien to hold me steady, her voice all business and focus. And amidst the continued racket of the Mafia war, my son was born safely. Damien, witnessing the birth of his child in the absolute depths of chaos and death, saw the final, humbling truth. I had prepared for every single scenario, every betrayal, every single catastrophic outcome, and I had, in the end, saved his son and his life. He stood up slowly, deliberately, holding our newborn son tucked carefully and securely into the crook of one arm and my semi-conscious, fragile body still tightly cradled in the other. And he turned slowly to face the two remaining, shocked soldiers of Il Sordo who had finally breached the room. He didn't hesitate. He didn't threaten. He simply gave the order to his waiting men, who had just rushed in behind the doctor. Kill them all. The victory was absolute, total, and horrifyingly clean. We had cheated death, and in the space of an hour, the entire structure of the Rossi Empire had been purged of its dangerous enemy, all because of the quiet little wife they all thought was weak and disposable. When the dust finally settled, and I was lying on a makeshift bed, my son tucked safely beside me, Damien knelt beside me, his large, powerful frame suddenly small and broken, and he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, his eyes full of the honesty I had craved for years. I cheated death, Elena, but not you. He gently placed his large, trembling hand over mine, his thumb stroking my wrist, a gesture of quiet, profound devotion and respect. If you still want the divorce, I'll sign the real papers now. I looked at him, weak but finally smiling, knowing I had forced him to see the man he had to be, the man who valued family over fear. My voice was a soft rasp, but the meaning was crystal clear and absolute. Damien, I never wanted a divorce. I wanted a husband. My name is Elena Rossi. I was the quiet girl, the underestimated wife, and the woman Damien thought he could control. He thought he controlled the entire empire, but my silence, my unwavering loyalty, and my meticulous planning saved it from total destruction. I was never a pawn. I was the one playing the long game. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.